What is Vocal Prayer? Part 4. Difficulties in Prayer. A reading from Jordan Allman's book, Spiritual Theology, beginning on page 240. There are two main sources of difficulty in the practice of prayer: distractions and dryness. These difficulties are not restricted to the prayer of petition, nor to any particular type of prayer. Consequently, what is said here should be applied to all the grades of prayer we shall discuss later. Since prayer is an operation of the practical intellect under the impetus of the will, by its very nature it requires attention, as does any other intellectual operation. But there are various degrees of attention, and not every type of prayer requires the same degree of attention. Indeed, in the higher grades of prayer, it would seem that the individual pays no attention at all to the act of prayer as such. With beginners in the practice of prayer, on the other hand, there may be a great deal of attention, but the prayer is as yet very imperfect. In order to understand this apparent paradox, it is necessary to consider the kinds of attention that can be used in prayer and the psychology of habit formation. Since prayer is conversation with God, it involves the use of words, whether one reads or speaks or merely thinks them. In the act of praying, one may focus attention on any one of three elements: the words themselves, e.g., to pronounce them correctly or use them rightly; the meaning of the words and content of the prayer as a whole; or the one to whom the prayer is addressed and the purpose of the prayer. In vocal prayer, it is essential that one be attentive to the words spoken. In meditation, one must give attention to the meaning of the words. But in any kind of prayer, the most important element is to fix the mind on God by the third kind of attention. Like any other human activity, the practice of prayer can become habitual, and therefore it falls under the laws of habit formation. Habits are acquired by the repetition of acts, and as a habit becomes more deeply rooted and perfected, the acts that flow from it are more facile, more pleasant, and require less actual attention. For that reason, habits are said to be second nature. In the practice of prayer, beginners will have to give attention to all the details and mechanics of prayer, so that they will learn to do things correctly from the start. Thus, the beginners in meditation will follow some method, but as they become more facile in the practice of prayer, the focal point of attention changes from words and methods and other mechanical details to the content of the prayer and the purpose of the prayer. Attention is still present, as indeed it must be for all prayer, but it is a different and more excellent type of attention. At this stage, one recites the rosary with practically no awareness of the words or their meaning, but with attention to a given mystery. Or one's attention in mental prayer has shifted from methods and devices to the content and purpose of the meditation. At this point, the soul is liberated, so to speak, so that it can soar to the higher grades of prayer, in which the mind is fixed on God so strongly that it forgets all other things. But however much we endeavor to keep our attention fixed on one thing, we cannot do so for an extended period of time. Even in the act of concentration, the human mind wavers, if only for a second. Fixed attention becomes all the more difficult as the object of concentration is loftier, or the time spent in concentration is longer. There is, of course, a great discrepancy in the powers of concentration and attention of various individuals due to temperament and training, but the human mind is also limited by the inherent weaknesses of man's psychosomatic nature. Our concern with distractions in prayer is not from the viewpoint of their effect on the merit of prayer, but their effect on the practice of prayer as such. Whether voluntary or involuntary, a distraction consists in any alien thought or imagination that prevents the mind from attending to that which it is doing. If the distraction affects the external senses or internal senses only, the mind can still give attention to what it is doing, but with difficulty. If the distraction consists in an alien thought in the mind itself, attention is completely destroyed, or rather, it is shifted to another object. Divided attention, or the complete lack of attention, in the performance of actions that involve manual operations or bodily movements, e.g., walking, dancing, eating, does not necessarily affect the perfection of the operation, but when it is a question of the operation of the higher faculties, Some degree of attention is absolutely necessary. Distractions in prayer, therefore, will always render it less perfect or will nullify it completely. We have stated that distractions in prayer may be voluntary or involuntary. In either case, there are obstacles to prayer, and they must be reduced and ultimately eliminated if one is to make progress in this spiritual exercise. To achieve this, it is necessary to examine the causes from which distractions spring. 1. Constitutional factors. Nervous or sanguine temperament. Vivid and unstable imagination. Weak powers of concentration. Vehement and uncontrolled passions. Sensate nature. 2. Physical or mental illness. Brain disorders. Glandular malfunction. Physical exhaustion, mental fatigue, neurotic traits, psychotic predispositions. 3. Character defects. Any acquired habits inimical to the practice of prayer, lack of recollection, dissipation, lukewarmness, vain curiosity, slothfulness, lust, gluttony, pride. 4. Improper spiritual direction. If the spiritual director imposes his own preconceived ideas upon the individual without understanding the needs of the soul, the capacity of the soul, and the movements of grace in the soul, e.g., to force a soul to practice meditation when God moves the soul to a higher degree of prayer. 5. The devil. With God's permission, the devil sometimes acts directly on the external and internal senses or indirectly distracts from the prayer by working through any of the other causes enumerated. 6. Unsuitable circumstances. Uncomfortable posture, improper time, external noises, lack of proximate preparation, excessive heat or cold. There is no infallible method for ridding oneself of all distractions in prayer because, as we have seen, it is the nature of the human mind to waver in its attention. Nevertheless, this does not excuse us from doing the best we can to pray with full attention and to forestall possible distractions to the best of our ability. To this end, one should approach prayer with a recollected spirit, putting aside all concern and interests and entering into prayer with the simple and pure motive of addressing God. In particular, one should prevent external distractions by selecting the proper time and place and a reasonably comfortable posture for prayer. When this is not possible, one should make every effort to withdraw oneself mentally from one's surroundings and to enter into the cell of the heart to speak with God. Even more important, one should rid oneself of internal sources of distraction by putting aside all thoughts of one's duties, anxieties, interests, except so far as they may be the subject matter of one's prayer. It is necessary to give full attention to the duty of the moment, which in this instance is the practice of prayer. As a remote preparation for prayer, the following points are of special importance: a spirit of silence and recollection, avoidance of vain curiosity, custody of the senses, spiritual reading practiced faithfully, and the practice of mortification. Aridity or dryness in the practice of prayer consists in a certain inability to produce the necessary intellectual and affective acts or in an actual distaste for prayer. It is usually encountered in the practice of mental prayer, and it reaches its most painful state in the higher stages of mystical prayer when it seems that God has abandoned the soul completely. Dryness in prayer may be caused by the individual, by God, or by the devil, but those who actually experience dryness should first suspect that they themselves are the cause. Among the internal and involuntary causes of dryness are bad health, bodily fatigue, excessive activity or absorbing duties, vehement and prolonged temptations that exhaust one's powers, improper training in the practice of prayer, methods of prayer unsuited to the individual. Sometimes, however, dryness is the natural result of one's own imperfections. Lukewarmness in the service of God, infidelity to grace, habitual venial sin, habits of sensuality, vain curiosity, instability and superficiality, excessive activism. At other times, dryness may be sent by God as a purification or a test. After a soul has become somewhat adept to the practice of prayer, God usually deliberately withdraws all sensible consolations so that the soul will be purified of any excessive attachment to such consolations, will be humbled at seeing how little it can do without God's help, and will thus be disposed for the next grade of prayer. Throughout one's advancement in the life of prayer, this alternation between dryness and consolation is usually perceptible at regular intervals, and especially when God is preparing the soul for some new advance or some greater grace. If the dryness is prolonged over a long period of time, in spite of the soul's fidelity to grace and earnest efforts, one may suspect that the soul is entering upon the night of the senses or some other passive purification. If, however, there is every indication that the dryness is caused by the devil, the soul should strive to be faithful in the practice of prayer, even if this means that it must return from a higher grade of prayer to the simple recitation of vocal prayers. The important thing is for the soul to do the best it can and under no pretext give up the practice of prayer, for that is precisely the goal the devil seeks to achieve. But since one should always suspect that dryness in prayer is due to one's own weakness and imperfection, the best remedy is to correct any defects in the practice of prayer, especially lukewarmness and negligence in the service of God. If the causes of the dryness are beyond one's control, the best thing to do is to resign oneself to the trial for as long as a time as God wills, to realize that sensible devotion and consolation are not essential to the true love of God, to humble oneself with a sense of one's unworthiness, and to persevere in prayer at any cost. The period of involuntary dryness can be periods of great merit and purification, especially if one unites oneself with the suffering Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. Other pitfalls to be avoided in the practice are the following. 1. Purely mechanical recitation of vocal prayers and lifeless routine in the practice of mental prayer. 2. Excessive personal effort, as if one were able to do all by sheer force, or undue passivity and inertia, as if one should leave all to God alone. 3. Discouragement at not perceiving the consolations one expected, or rash optimism that one is further advanced in prayer than one really is. 4. Attachment to sensible consolation, which causes in the soul a certain spiritual gluttony that impels one to seek the consolations of God rather than the God of consolations. 5. Persistence in the use of a particular method, as if that were the only possible method, or the premature abandonment of a method. End of part 4.